Hello, I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Doug.
And welcome back to the Krewe Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture. Welcome back to our podcast. Today we're going to explore the world of Japanese translation and localization.
If you're learning Japanese and wondering what you're going to actually do with it, translation may be one of the many professions that uses Japanese, especially if your goal is to have an understanding of higher level Japanese and its application.
In this episode, we'll be interviewing translator and localization director for a gaming industry, Jenn O'Donnell. She'll be giving us her experience in the industry and how and what she did to get there. This is a valuable opportunity that you don't want to miss. All right, so Doug, we are here today to talk about translation. Do you know what translation is? Like, I would assume you know, like, the basics of...
Yeah, I mean, I understand like the concept of like just what translation is and what the work would entail in a very high level. I've attempted to translate books on my own, not a lot, in very small quantity. When I was learning Japanese in like school, I would try to take some of the stuff, and I struggled mightily with because it was very much more beyond my skill set and level at that point in time. But I know just it's taking it from language A, in this case Japanese, into language B, which would be English. But that's that up until our interview. I had an idea at a very high level, but just in general, I struggle with the nuance that comes along with translation work.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of have the same experience as you, especially as like the nerd that I am. I read a lot of manga, I watch a lot of anime, and I play a lot of video games. And a lot of that has to do with translation. It comes from Japan and it comes over here. And kind of like you, when I was actively studying, I remember I was having a study session with one of my friends. We would meet every Wednesday. And one of the things that we did to kind of like just, get into a more fun pattern of studying is we took one of my Japanese manga that I had like multiple copies of, and we would try to translate it into English. And, you know, it's so hard when you're not used to like translating, because I found myself translating the Japanese directly
Yeah.
into the English. So then it came out wonky. So I had to translate that English into like my English. It took longer than it should have taken. And so, I give credit to translators. They work their butts off and they deserve so much credit that they probably don't get.
Little did you know you were partaking in localization, right?
Yeah.
Without even knowing it. Yeah, that's one thing I struggle with too when I was doing my like impromptu stuff. I would I had I think in college I had a couple manga that I would pick up, just something simple. Not simple. It was definitely not simple, but something that I had interest in the story.
Mhm.
I was familiar with the English version of the story, and I wanted to try and take a stab at making it like turning into my English. But yeah, I did the same thing where I was just direct um, direct translation. It wasn't very free flowing, and the final product was very much rigid.
Yeah.
And it's an art, because you need to not only master the understanding of what it means in Japanese, but also need to have a way of communicating it in like common vernacular of English. And that's where I think having a background also in English literature, or maybe not literature but composition,
Mhm.
helps with that kind of work, because you need to be a master of not only understanding a language but kind of manipulating it into sounding something very very fluid
Yeah,
and
exactly.
natural.
Exactly. Because I also used to do it because my friend and I would get bored constantly. So we would like always change things up. And we also did song lyrics. We would print out Japanese song lyrics and try to translate it. But whoo, that is a different beast in itself.
Yeah, I never like, song lyrics are weird because when you're reading or if you watch, like a theme or for a TV show where they're translating the lyrics or something where there's maybe a music video and there's lyrics at the bottom in English, and you're reading it, but you're listening and the words aren't matching up with the words that are showing up in the written phrase because it's just the timing of
Yeah.
and the sentence structure and the
Backward.
word structure of those songs and how they may phrase it, in English, you may do in phrases or whatever,
Yeah.
but same thing in Japanese, but just maybe jumbled up differently.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work like in English. When you directly translate, it doesn't flow
Yeah.
to the song or whatever, so you have to kind of adapt, and it's yeah, it's a challenge. It really is an art form, I would almost say, to be able to do this.
I'll agree with that, yeah. I think it is an art form, and, when you pick up, say, a video game, you might be thinking about the graphics, you might be thinking about the voice acting, you might be thinking about gameplay, but what you should really be thinking about, especially if you do the original voice acting, is those translations that they give you. I think it's such an underrated profession, and it takes so much skill to do something like that. So next time you pick up a video game, you better, thank someone for those translations.
Yeah, there's a lot of legwork that goes in behind the scenes that we'll find out shortly, through our conversation with Jennifer. Which one do we pick for the interview? You'll find that out because we have Jennifer from our podcast,
Yeah.
and then we have Jennifer that we're gonna interview, and then they assigned me ahead of the interview. I'm Jen and I'm Jennifer, and I definitely messed it up at least once.
Yeah.
I don't know if we edited that out or not. I can't remember, but yeah. But yeah, you'll find that out. It's something where really there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you don't realize. And again, the whole localization piece too, whereas it's not just translating it word to word, sentence to sentence, but it's also making it flow and sound more natural. But yeah, I think it's such um, a cool job to have because you really are like your work is going to impact the world's
Experience.
enjoyment
Yeah.
of that game or that book or that movie or whatever. It's going to impact their entertainment value. So you really have a very large role, whether you want to believe so or not, as a translator, a localizer, in there.
Yeah, you need to know Japanese.
Yeah, yeah. You could fly by, you can cut some corners, I guess. You can find out like what you can shave off things and use context clues to kind of round out things, but yeah, you need to have a really strong grasp. Um and one thing we'll touch on too in the interview very briefly, maybe not very briefly, but we'll touch on it, is the difference between interpretation and translation.
Mm.
Because I would sometimes unintentionally use them interchangeably when they're very much very different. Whereas I feel like translation is more of a physical, tangible, visual um, aspect to that language conversion, whereas interpretation is more on the fly,
Yeah.
um, vocal, audio esque version of that same type of work. But you're not only just doing it from one language to another; you're doing it back and forth potentially,
Yeah.
depending on the gig.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Okay, so this is probably going to be very focused on video games. I could tell this episode will be. But, if you do watch, I don't know, E3 or something of like some kind of gaming conference, and, let's say Nintendo comes on and they have, their spotlight of what's coming out, they always have an interpreter
Yeah.
right there. And that's kind of you see, I mean, they speak Japanese and an interpreter's like, "Alright, so this is what he said," and, like,
Yeah, you
I
just
mean,
gotta go back and
on
forth.
the spot.
Yeah, and I do wonder, what it's like to be one of those interpreters that is doing, like, conventions where you get some weird ass questions from guests that are going to like, live, where it's just
So
really awkward, and you're like, "Wait, can you say that again? Wait," and then you have to think about it because 'cause you're never expecting some of these questions, like, what size is your underwear? Or, like, maybe not that, but, some really, like, off the wall thing that's completely off the topic and that some of I've been to some conventions, a variety of conventions, and I know some of those panels can get a little loose in terms of
Yeah,
what kind of questions
we
are
sure
asked.
can.
So I think that you have to be really flexible and willing to kind of put yourself on this. You are on the spot to
Yeah,
make
you
this
definitely
translation because then you have to bridge the gap and maybe smooth over some of the context from the initial language to the other, to
yeah.
maybe make it less offensive or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So our interview today is with Jenn O'Donnell. I met Jen early in my freelancing career and my blogging. And she was a blogger at the time, and I was a blogger, and a viewer who knew both of us introduced us together and was like, "Hey, you should, meet Jen. She loves Japan too. She studies Japanese." So I'm like, "Okay, I'll reach out." So I reach out and we clicked immediately. Our friendship was just right there, and we collaborated like several times on our blogs. And she eventually stopped blogging as much as she used to, but I made sure to stay in touch with her, made sure to keep up with all the exciting things that she was doing in translation, because that's just what she was passionate about. And ever since, I just keep on following her, and she is where she is today. Like I said, she does localization now, and I thought she was just going to be a really good guest for this kind of episode. So without further ado, let's go to the interview. All right. So we are here with Jenn O'Donnell today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good. Yes. Okay. I'm glad we could have you today on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yay! Yeah, no problem. You and I kind of go way back with our own blogging about Japan. So I knew that you would be really good for this episode.
Thank you again for joining us. But what we like to do usually with our guests is give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. Give a little bit of a background. You don't have to go full autobiography or anything like that, but whatever if you want to just introduce yourself for those who may not be familiar with you and your work.
Sure. My name's Jenn O'Donnell. I'm a Japanese to English translator and a localization director, working for a video game company in Japan. I also blog on the side about learning Japanese and about translation in general. And besides that, just probably spend way too much time reading manga, books, and playing games.
I can relate with the game thing. I don't do manga as much. I do read a little bit of One Piece here and there, whenever I have a chance. But yeah, I wish I could read a little bit more. So another question we ask our guests when they come on, we are a New Orleans based podcast for the most part, and what we like to ask our guests is if they've had a connection to New Orleans in the past. Have you been before? And if you have, what is your fondest or funniest or most unique memory? But if you haven't, when someone says the name New Orleans, what is the first thing that you think of?
So, because I'm British, I've never actually been to New Orleans and pronounce it differently. I know, sorry. But when people say New Orleans, I actually think of The Princess and the Frog, the
Ah,
Disney movie.
yeah,
Oh, okay. That's the first thing that we've ever heard that like someone say that. No one's ever said the movie yet.
usually it's Mardi Gras or Bourbon Street or jazz.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, maybe it's because I'm British, so we don't have
Yeah,
the New Orleans culture. So the only exposure I've ever got was through media, which is like Princess and the Frog or the
cool.
movie Chef. Um, I know about it. My spouse's mum went to university there. She lived there for a little bit, so that's the extent of my knowledge,
Hey,
unfortunately.
the Disney fan in me is very, very happy about your response.
Yay.
Now to get down to the main content of our podcast, and we want to start this off by kind of giving our listeners a sense of how you even started with like why Japan, what led to your interest in Japan, and eventually your work experience in Japan.
Do you have longer than an hour?
Give it your best
Yeah.
shot.
Take as much time as you want.
Don't say that. That's a terrible idea. I guess it started when I was probably just before I turned 17. A friend of mine was studying Japanese in what in the UK we call college, which is about high school age. And I thought, oh, wow, that's really cool. Do you mind introducing me to your teacher? Partially because I was trying to impress her, but also partially because it was actually really cool. So I started learning Japanese with her teacher, just an hour a week for like 2 years. And then she said, oh, I'm going to Japan and I get a discount if somebody comes with me. Do you want to come? So the two of us went to Japan, and that's when I like actually really fell in love with Japan and the language, because I studied in a language school for 2 months and worked on a farm for 2 months doing volunteer through WOOF, a worldwide organization for organic farms. And that just blew my mind. And I was like, this is amazing and I love it. And I want to keep learning Japanese. Like, up to that point, any hobby I picked up, I tend to drop after like 2 months. But Japanese was one that I kept going for years, even though I was never really good at it. And so when I went to university, again, I it was just a hobby. I wasn't really taking it seriously. So I thought, well, I don't really know what I want to do at university. But the, I guess, counselor suggested, oh, social anthropology at this university has a year in Japan. I'm like, oh, that sounds perfect. I don't know what social anthropology is, but it sounds perfect. And so I went to university, I studied abroad in Japan. And then at the end of my degree, I realized no one knows what social anthropology is, and it's not exactly marketable. But Japanese is. So I figured I would use my Japanese, but I wasn't good enough to be a translator. I don't want to be a translator. I didn't want to be an English teacher either, because in my stupid brain, I thought, oh, this will deter my English ability or my Japanese ability. And so I didn't apply for JET. I'm one of the few people who have never done JET. I've never taught English, even though it's a really good profession, really, really good.
It's a great entry point, right?
A really great entry point.
Yeah.
So I kind of shot myself in the foot by not doing it.
No, but you still got there.
Yes, I did. Yeah. So because I figured, oh, I want to use it in a business setting, because obviously that's what adults do. That's what grown-ups do. And so I came back to Japan and I studied for 6 months to pass the N2. I ended up getting a job at a company in America, in Michigan, that did system diagnostic tools for vehicles. And they were like, oh, we want to send someone to Japan. I'm like, this is perfect. It's business, it's professional, it's adult, and I'll end up in Japan. And I got to America and they said, yeah, we haven't actually got an office in Japan. So we hope you can set one up. I was like, okay. Like, fresh out of university, no idea what I was doing. And they didn't know what they were doing. And so the whole thing just fell through. And I was like, well, I've been here for a year. I haven't done anything. I feel like I'm stagnating. I'm not in Japan. I'm not where I want to be. And that's when I started coming around to the idea of doing translation. But I didn't think I was good enough to be a translator. So I thought, oh, well, you need education. So I took a master's degree in translation, which didn't work out either. I got my master's degree. I got a first class honors from SOAS in London, but it didn't really teach me how to translate. And so afterwards I had to relearn how to translate, how to market myself as a freelance translator. And then that kind of snowballed into everything else. I guess I still never really had much confidence in myself as a translator and that I could actually do it. But then over the years, serendipity ended up working out. And now I'm a translator and I work for a game company.
It's a pretty incredible route that you took to get to Japan and to be where you are.
Yeah, it was not conventional.
Yeah, and especially for someone who, like you said in the beginning, like, you didn't want to be a translator,
No.
and now look at you. You're
Yeah.
you're you're like, all I want to do is be a
Yes,
translator.
I love translation so much.
Yeah, so you kind of answered our next question already that we were going to ask. But I was going to say, like, the typical route, not I don't want to say typical, but like a very common route, like you mentioned, is the JET program. I was on the JET program for 3 years. So I know exactly what you're talking about. I have many friends that are still in Japan post JET doing various types of jobs, whether it's still teaching English or working in, as one was a lawyer, and just various things. But you went less, the non-JET route, which is much more difficult. Do you have any tips for folks that are trying to get into that, trying to find a non-JET avenue to get into Japan for a professional, like in a professional setting?
It is really difficult, especially now with the whole situation where
Yeah.
visas, it's hard to get a visa sponsorship. Honestly, I think one of the frustrating things is that it is there is an element of luck.
Yeah, there really is.
But you can set yourself up to have a bit more luck by just networking. I mean, it's
Hmm.
obviously not going to pay off immediately, but the reason I ended up in Japan was because I was marketing myself. I was learning about marketing myself as a translator. That's when I started blogging about translation and connecting with the wider community. And I think one day I just lamented on Twitter saying, "Oh, I really wish I was in Japan. I was working in Japan, but I haven't done it, but I'll get there eventually." Like in my mind, I was like, "Well, my goal is to live in Japan in the next 5 years." And a friend of mine contacted me. He said, "Hey, this game company are looking for translators. I think you should apply because you'd be a good fit." I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, I mean, it's probably never going to go anywhere, but it can't hurt." And I applied, and I went through the interview process, and I ended up getting the job. And I turned to my spouse and was like, "So, what do you think about living in Japan?" And he was
Sounds
like,
great.
"Yeah, sure, why not?" Because he's also a Japanese translator. He translates manga and light novels, so
Okay.
it's it was really easy for him because we were both freelancing at the time. And so I was like,
Yeah.
"Well, I have a job now, so I guess we're moving to Japan." But it really was an element of luck, having a friend introduce me, and then obviously my own ability to get through the interview process.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring up networking a little bit later on, but since we're kind of on that topic, I actually listened to your episode of How to Japanese podcast with Daniel Morales. I'm a good friend of his. He's from New Orleans as well.
Oh, really?
We were on jet together in Fukushima, which is actually where I met him,
What?
ironically. Yeah,
What?
yeah, I met him there, and I was like, "Oh, wait, you're from New Orleans? What?" So he came back, and we were both on. We did the Jet alumni group here for a bit. So we became friends that way. And I listened to the interview, and it was a fantastic interview, by the way.
Oh,
Really,
good.
really,
I
really
was really worried
enlightening.
about I rambled too much.
No, it was great. It was really great. But that you mentioned on the podcast as well, professional networking and the importance of it. Now, I guess what are some good ways to network? Because a lot of people they may want to do this, but like you said, you started a blog. But
Mhm.
are there other ways to go about networking outside of maybe blogging? And I mean, there's LinkedIn too. But for someone that's actually tapped into the localization and translation network, is there another avenue that people can take to go
Mhm.
that route?
So similarly, I thought LinkedIn was the best way to go. It's not. It's completely useless. It's not completely useless, but it wasn't exactly useful for me.
Yeah, LinkedIn. Oh my God, don't even get me started there.
I think LinkedIn is good for proper adult professionals, and then you have like this the sphere of creative translation, especially Japanese to English, where a lot of people are like manga and anime. We're all a bunch of nerds, and we're all a bunch of like big kids. So LinkedIn is not like the ideal place to meet those kinds of people.
Yeah.
Honestly, the best resource I found is Twitter, and just engaging with people, talking with people, sharing useful information. Really, I mean, that's also why I started the blog, is sharing useful information for other people is a good way for people to think, "Oh, this person knows what they're talking about." And I guess at the start, I didn't exactly know what I was talking about, but I just kind of it built up over time because then I was able to educate myself. But yes, giving people useful information through blogs or articles, even just posting articles on LinkedIn actually was how it started. I posted just a thought piece about how good the localization of Ni no Kuni was on LinkedIn, and the company that translated it was like, "Hey, can we share this? Do you have a website?" I was like, "Oh no, I don't." But that gave me the idea to start the website, and then that actually helped me get jobs down the line because of the companies I ended up working for. And so it was like, "Oh, this is." I didn't intend for it to help with networking or with getting a job down the road, but did end up feeding into that.
It's
But
crazy how things
really,
work out like that, right?
yeah, it really is. You just don't expect it. Like, again, an element of luck.
Yeah.
But Twitter really has been one of the best resources for connecting with different translators.
I was about to say I follow a lot of like, I don't want to say it's the same circle, but I with building our Twitter presence, we've been following people that are our guests, but also who they interact with, and I feel like I look at certain a lot of people, and everyone knows everybody. It's like kind of a
Yes.
small small circle. So yeah, have you been able to collaborate or team up with any of the folks in your network for projects on your own outside of your big projects you work on?
No, I would love to. I honestly would absolutely love to work with certain people, but just haven't had an opportunity to. But we do. I have an editor and a translator friend, and we have a book club, and we meet once every maybe 6 weeks, and we drink wine and we talk about books. And I'm in a translation book club where we talk about translated novels, and that's really fun as well. So we don't. I guess I interact with the community beyond work. It's not always professional,
Yeah.
which I think is the best thing to do it, because you can. There are some people who have contacted me, and you can tell in the way they message and the way they talk that they're like, oh, this is what I need to network for a professional, not actually trying to get to know me as a human being. And so I don't interact with those people because I'm like, I know what you're after. I know what you're up to.
It's a fine line to walk, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like you want to be professional, but you also don't want it to be looking like you're just fishing for
Yes.
fishing for
Yeah.
their knowledge without actually wanting to develop that relationship. That relationship building is definitely something I've
Mm-hmm.
learned along the way, just in the IT world that I work in. Like, just you have to build those relationships with people if you really want to
Mm-hmm.
sustain having that network that you have. That's awesome.
And it takes time as well. You can't just ask, hey, how do I become a translator? You have to do a lot of legwork yourself,
Yeah.
research, and then you can ask professionals, hey, what do you think of this? I tried this, can you give me some advice? And then we're always helping each other out as well professionally. I'm in a few discords and translation discords, and people are always helping each other out.
Yeah, I feel like the asking of how to do it is the easy part. It's actually doing it is the hard part. So I can
Mm-hmm.
totally understand that. Um and then when you were talking earlier about how you thought you needed the education to do translation, so you went back and got your masters. What do you feel are I mean, you have a very unique situation, I feel, probably. But for someone who is interested in this line of work, what would you maybe suggest from your experience? Like what employers are looking for? Like, are they looking for that education, or are they more looking for like work experience?
They are definitely looking for work experience more. But the problem you have is, how do I get work experience when you won't give me a chance? Like, how do you get your foot in the door? And education is often a really good but very, very expensive way to get that foot in the door. You can
Mm,
find education for translation that is um, not a master's degree. Like, after my MA, I ended up moving to Seattle in Washington. And there's this college, Bellevue College, has this amazing program that is designed for adults who have full time jobs. So all the classes are in the evenings, where they train your translation skills, translation ethics, how to use term based management systems and computer aided translation tools. And then you learn how to actually translate from your paired languages. So the first core modules are all monolingual English based only on skill building. And so it's a really, really, really good program that teaches you how to translate ethically and well, really. And then you can use that to network with your classmates. And that program only cost a couple of $100 per class. Like, you're paying tens of thousands of dollars for an MA, or you're paying like maybe $2,000 for this evening class that's aimed at adults. And that was a lot more valuable and cheaper. So you don't have to do a master's degree in order to, if you want education in translation. The trick is obviously finding those schools.
Yeah, and the most frustrating part too is, like you said, the financial investment that goes into like secondary education, or even, beyond the bachelor's degree. It's so expensive and time consuming, but
Mm,
also sometimes I feel like you're paying for the little letters that you put behind your name. Then
yes.
like that opens the doors. Oh, you have a master's on your on your resume or your CV. Okay, you're much more qualified than this person that doesn't. It's that perception that you're paying for. But when you have
Hmm.
those programs out there, it's that are so much more beneficial to the profession you're trying to get into. You would hope that they put weight on those types of programs as well.
Hmm. I think I do, and I guess it really depends on how you present yourself as well. Like writing resumes, writing cover letters is a huge part of selling yourself as a professional. Again, I think blogs can help a lot with that because it conveys that you know what you're talking about without having the fancy degree. And so many translators, I think the majority of translators don't have degrees or professional translation education. Like they learned on the job, they learned from their mistakes, they learned from other people, and I think that's so important as well. Like you don't need an expensive master's degree.
I'll vouch for that. Yeah, I'll definitely vouch for that because with my job, I kind of like you, Jen. Like I had my blog. That's kind of how we met. Was we were blog buddies.
Hmm.
And we exchanged blogs and we worked on each other's blogs and stuff like that. And when I got my job, I put my blog on my resume, and it was like an unofficial official way of saying, "Hey, I know a lot about Japan, so I should have this job." Even though I didn't have a master's in like Japanese, I don't know, literature or something. Anything. I just had a regular bachelor's degree and then had this blog that I was working on, and it seemed to work just fine, honestly.
Yeah, because it shows you a level of passion as well. Like
Yeah,
passion is
definitely.
so important.
Yeah, like even my boss asks me here and there, "Are you still writing on your blog?" Like she always asks. So obviously it did something right. For my next question for you, which I think is an interesting question myself, because probably like years ago when I was like just not, I don't know, I guess I didn't research well enough, but I kind of got this stuff confused as well. But like the occupation of being a translator versus being an interpreter. A lot of people get those two confused. So for the sake of everyone, all of our listeners listening to this podcast, could you briefly describe the differences between the two? And then also tag along with that why you yourself chose to be in translation over being an interpreter.
So I think, yeah, one of the biggest things you see online is someone goes, "Hey, I'm looking for a Japanese to English translator for this event." And you get a bunch of people applying, being like, "Hey, I translate," and then oh no, they're looking for an interpreter. But because again of the misunderstanding, they have the wrong people saying, "Hey, I can help you," and that doesn't help either party. So a very very loose definition would be a translator works with written text and an interpreter works with speaking. So, but when you have when an interpreter interprets, you often say that they're translating because it's just how English works and how people's interpretation of language works. So you can say, "Oh, this interpreter translates this person for me," but really the correct terminology should be they're interpreting. So yeah, it is frustrating when you see that happen because you're like, "Oh no, I'm really sorry, but you're looking for an interpreter. Can you try this again? Because otherwise you're not going to get what you're looking for." Um, but again, I mean, most people don't know that, and I think you have to give them, like, everybody learns somehow. But actually, I didn't want to be a translator, but I always wanted to be an interpreter.
Wow, really?
Yeah, the first time, the first time I went to Japan, I remember thinking, "Oh my goodness, this is amazing! I love this country. I love working with people. I love like talking." I actually don't love talking about me, but I love talking about other people and about other things. So I'd love to be an interpreter. And so actually, I've been working towards interpreting for several years
I
now.
feel like there's being an interpreter is so intimidating because you have to be like on the spot. Whereas at least with translation, you can
Hmm.
consult, books or other literature or a colleague. Whereas interpretation, on the spot interpretation, at least, is if you mess up, it's like that's like, oh man, hold on, let me take that back. It's the pressure, yeah.
One of the best things, because the Bellevue College has an interpreting and a translation
Hmm.
um, courses. So I took both as far as I could. And one of the best things that interpreting teacher said was, because she's a legal interpreter, and so she said that as a part of her oath is she promises to translate to the best of her ability
Ah,
or interpret to the best of her ability. And so that's all you can do, is you can interpret to the best of your ability. And if you hope a major mistake doesn't happen, but if you don't get everything, it's not the end of the
as
world.
long as you convey the message, right?
Yes. And I mean,
Yeah.
I've interpreted it like 2 events, and I'm pretty sure I made horrible mistakes. There was one where I completely blanked on like a really really simple word because I wasn't expecting it, and my brain was like, but it ended up, despite the hiccups, it ended up working out in the end. And
When you're interpreting, are you a listen to everything and then just process and go, or are you a note taker?
oh no, no, note taker, note taker, note taker. I can't just do
Okay.
it off the top of my head. My brain does not work that way. Short
Yeah,
term
I
memory is terrible.
I see people that do that. Oh my god, it blows my mind. I'm like, I got to sit there and take notes, but my then at the same time, I'm taking notes and then I don't hear the rest of it. So I'm not a good note taker. So I don't know. That's why I never
I
want to
think
be an
that's why
interpreter.
actually for interpreting you do need training, because it helps to have somebody go through and teach you the core skills of like how to listen and make notes and keep track of everything at the same time. Like the teacher showed us this amazing interpretation between, I think it was President Obama and somebody else, and and like he's talking for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and the interpreter is making notes, and then he stops, and after 10 minutes, she then conveys everything, and it's like that's like really really high level, probably 20 years of experience.
Yeah, it's incredible.
So you were saying how you did about 2 interpreting, jobs. Was that before you made the decision to be a translator, or was that after the decision to be a translator? Because 'Cause I'm just trying to figure out where at the same time, okay.
It was at the same time. So it was when I was freelance translating, and I was taking these interpreting classes to kind of build up that skill, because I thought it'd be a helpful skill to have. And then a friend contacted me and said, "Hey, uh, this person's looking for an interpreter for it was LA Anime Expo," which actually worked out because that was the same time I took my interview at the at one of the game companies, because they had an office in LA. And so I went for an interview there while I was also at this event interpreting. And so those events have mostly been volunteer work at conventions, like interviewing,
Interpreting.
interpreting for,
Yeah.
yeah, for
I know all about that. I actually got offered that same
commercial
exact
people.
position, but not at Anime Expo. It was at our local convention, MechaCon. But I had to nix it because I was like, I don't think I'm there yet. But so were those experiences good for you? Like,
Oh yes.
okay.
Did it push you in a direction one way or the other? Like, was it like, oh, I didn't enjoy that as much as I thought I would, and then I decided to go to
No,
translation, or did it leave a door open for you?
in my mind, translation and interpreting go hand in hand. At
Okay.
least for me. Like obviously, you don't have to be an interpreter if you're a translator, but they're just useful skills to have, especially working in house for a video game company. Having somebody on the team who can interpret is really really helpful. And so I want to get to the point where I'm one of those people where they're like, oh, we need someone to interpret for this, can you help out? And I'm starting in my company now to have more opportunities where I can do that. Obviously not in any big events, but internal meetings with maybe overseas clients or something like that. So Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue
Mhm.
to my next question actually is for your occupation, what tasks are expected of you and what are some of the challenges that you may face as a translator?
So my role is a localization director, which is kind of a mix between a translator and a project manager. So it's a little more involved where I'm managing projects and I'm managing translators of other languages while also helping to translate emails and maybe promotional information. It honestly depends on the day, it's so varied. When I was working as a freelance translator, it was just I get sent the original Japanese, I translate it into English, I send it off, and I never hear back. But working in house is a lot more involved. I'm working with people. I'm constantly talking to the editor about, hey, do you think this is the right wording for this? What do you think of this? Can you check this for me? And so I really, 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 really enjoy working in house because I can work with a lot more people. Again, that's why I wanted to be an interpreter, is so I could work with people and not be a little freelance translator island where I don't talk to anybody for weeks on end. Honestly, after a year of freelance translating, I was going crazy because I was like, I need social interactions.
Did COVID change how you and your colleagues worked? Did you always go into an office, or was there some like remote aspect always incorporated into your job?
I actually changed companies halfway through
Oh
COVID.
yeah.
Yeah, I left one game company, I went to another, and so when I went to the new one, there was already restrictions in place, so we weren't allowed to go out for lunch together in large groups. There are partitions between all the desks. Social distancing is obviously still important, so most of my interactions were over chat. When the numbers were lower, we did go out for a couple of drinks, and that was super awesome. But now the numbers have gone up again, so it has made it a lot more difficult to interact outside of work. But I think whether we'd be working from home or whether we were working in the office,
Okay.
most of communication would be over chat.
'Cause I was gonna say, like, is it something where, do you guys, since if you had gone into a from a in person to a remote setting, would you do like Zoom calls or something like that like to talk over projects and kind of like put scope and design like a plan and all that stuff? Is that something you would do typically, or
If we were, there was one point where I was working from home at my last company, and we were doing daily Zoom chats,
okay?
partially as a way of not going stir crazy. I think also as a way for the company to make sure that you were at your desk. Um,
Yeah.
because for some reason they're really untrusting of people working from home, even though when you're in an office, you often see Japanese people like asleep at their desks. I was like, how is that
It's
different?
all about the visibility, right?
Yeah.
You're physically present.
Yeah, they need to you don't have to be there working, but you have to be there.
Yes. It's really annoying. It's like I could be so much more productive.
It reminds me of Jet. I would be sitting at my desk some days for 7 periods. "Oh, we canceled your classes. We had a preparation for the Undokai." And I'm like, "Oh,
Thanks
okay."
for telling me in
So I'm just
advance.
like, "Yeah, yeah." So, I mean, I sit there and I just study Japanese, and I'm like, "Well, it could be worse. I'm getting paid to study. That's great."
um like what would be the job requirements?
Depends on the job. I think that's another thing, is that every single company is different. If you at least the so I did a talk for the Japan Association of Translation last year, earlier this year. I don't remember. Time is weird, and I was representing the entertainment special interest group, and a lot of entertainment translators freelance, and then sometimes they'll go in house. But the guy modding it was, I think, a technical translator, and he said that's really surprising because in every other field you work in house for the goal of then going freelance. So, but within entertainment translation, I think if you're freelancing, you need obviously a very solid understanding of Japanese, but also a very solid understanding of English, and to be able to convey the Japanese in a very natural sounding way. I think that's very difficult for a lot of beginner translators who tend. I mean, I also did this when I started. Was stuck a little too close to the Japanese wording, and so the English would sound weird, but I was like, well, that's what the Japanese says, so obviously that's okay. And it is okay for like some manga publishing companies, but when you start to move into games, that's where you go into more of a, we're looking for entertaining and natural sounding English. And so having the skill to be able to write really good English is very important.
I'm not sure if I'm correct. I mean, you and I have known each other for years, so I kind of like I sort of have like this timeline in my head of like all your work, but you did at one point do translating for manga, correct?
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
good. Making sure I
yes.
got that right because I swear I
Yep,
could
yep.
have like remembered you saying that you did that. um,
Yeah, when I freelanced, I mostly translated manga and I did a little anime and a few light novels as well.
yeah, I think I remember one of the light novels that you did. Um, but um, But now that you're doing the localization for games, what are the differences? Are there any differences, honestly, versus, translating for manga versus, translating for games? I know you said that maybe like the way you would translate it would be different, but like, are there any other differences between the two, or do they kind of like coincide and go together?
They they coincide and they don't. Like there's definitely an overlap between all of these. Um, just because it's all entertainment and so it's all, but with game, okay, so some people misunderstand localization as quote unquote creative translation, but within the industry localization actually describes translation, editing, translating into different languages, graphics, because you have to change graphics from Japanese into other languages, sound checking, the QA. So localization within the industry, at least within game localization, describes the overall process of taking a game from Japanese into other languages. It's not just quote unquote creative translation. But I think some people interpret that way because they only see the English, they only see the final product, and they don't see all the work that goes into it. So game localization definitely. I think if you were freelance, you'd be hired to just translate the Japanese into English and then send it back, and maybe depending on the company, have a little back and forth where you can edit or check implementation. But most of the time, you just get the text out of context, translate it, and send it back, and then somebody else will see it in context and fix it and edit and improve it. Whereas working in house, translating you translate and then you see it in game and then you tweak it and then you see it in game again and then somebody else because they're basing their translation on your English go, hey, this doesn't make sense, and you're like, oh yes, that doesn't make sense, let me reword it. And so it's a lot more of a polishing process rather than just translate and send back.
So do they translate you do you had mentioned like translating from your English. Are you translating to other languages based off the Japanese or the English translation?
Depends on the project. Me
Okay.
personally, I don't know any other language,
Yeah.
but like the last project I did, it was based on the English, and so other translators based their translation on my English.
Who determines that? Is that the company or the game producer?
It's the it's probably a collaborative effort between the director and the localization department,
Okay.
sort of saying, hey, this is how much it would cost if you did it this way. This is how much it would cost if you did it this way. And so it's sort of there is a level of prep before localization even starts of coordinating, hey, what languages are we going to do? How are we going to approach this? And so it's normally a game localization can go on for several years before they even come out. And most companies tend to now simultaneously release the original Japanese with the other languages. And so the Japanese needs to be in somewhat finished state before localization can start. It never is. So they're always changing things. So then obviously all the other languages need to change to match it.
Do you is there ever ever a reason or a chance or some or it has does it ever happen where you have someone that is targeting for localization projects? Are you targeting like countries like different English speaking countries and producing different content? Like if you're contextualizing something, and do you have maybe someone that's like a British person targeting like the British audience versus an Australian audience versus an American audience? When you have to put some of those things into context for those cultures, is that something that you see a lot too, or is it mostly just like English and they just kind of put everything in like a? one bubble?
Mostly, yeah, mostly it's just English.
Okay.
But we still have to take in consideration how different cultures will interpret the language. Like, let's say you use the word fanny, and in American English that means butt, but in British English that means
Something else.
something else, something else, which is a little more rude. And so it's like, oh well, we probably can't use this word because it could be it could be interpreted out of context in this culture. But you can't like release a British edition and an American edition anymore. Like they used to do that, but it's just not
It's not as
feasible
common.
cost
Yeah.
wise. Yeah, it's not as common. And it's the same with like Spanish is the big one because you have European Spanish, Mexican Spanish, South American Spanish, and then even within South America, it changes depending on the country, and so you have to decide really early on what kind of Spanish are we translating this into. What impact will that have on the game? Like, how are we going to handle this? And so that's the kind of things you need to consider.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's really good fun. I love the challenges that come up with these kinds of projects.
Yeah. So with obviously to be a translator, you have to be proficient in Japanese, right? It's kind of like the number one prerequisite. But some of your methods of studying, what approach did you take when you were learning Japanese? Were you more of a textbook learner, or did you learn more out of the textbook, like maybe through some people like to
Mm-hmm.
immersion learning. We had a guest previously on our podcast that specializes in that approach. What was your approach to studying Japanese?
I tried everything. I've been studying Japanese for probably about 14 years now. So, and I found out when I was 25 that I'm dyslexic, which explains a lot. So I've studied. Okay, so for me personally, I think I'm an auditory learner and a kinesthetic learner. So I learn best by working with teachers and by doing and interacting, which is probably why I always gravitated towards interpreting and towards speaking Japanese more than writing and reading, because I guess I struggled with that without realizing that I was struggling. And so personally, I found studying abroad in Japan at language schools and working with teachers incredibly helpful. But now that I'm at a certain level of proficiency, I read novels, like ridiculous amounts of novels, and that has been an amazing way to learn. It's a very slow process because I forget things all the time because of my dyslexia and I'm a slow reader. But it's for me personally, I think it's definitely helped a lot to actually use the language. I guess it's sort of immersive, but because I'm married to an American, we speak English all the time. So it's not as immersive as it could be, but that's fine. It works for me.
Yeah, yeah. When you were reading novels in Japanese, do you like if you come across a word you don't know, do you stop and look it up, or do you try to just keep reading and then try to get context to define what that word is? And then maybe you get to the end of the paragraph and you're like, okay, I still have no idea what the hell they're talking about. Then look it up. Is that how you approach it? Or because I know when I tried doing that initial reading in Japanese, I was stopping and checking things all the time, and I just found it took away from the experience, and really it
Mm-hmm.
became a chore more than and
Mm.
something enjoyable.
I think it definitely helps to be enjoyable. I enjoy looking up the words, so that I don't have issue with that. I'm like, oh, this is a really cool word. I wonder what it means. Um, so because I enjoy it, I like looking up the words. But if I feel tired or I'm being really lazy, I won't look up every single word. It really does depend on my mood. Like I've learned over the years to trust how I feel and to trust my gut and not to do everything the same way every single time or to do what people say. Because you get people who are like, oh, you should do this. Like I've learned to ignore those people and to kind of
Yeah,
go my own flow. So I tend to look up words unless I'm feeling really lazy.
yeah. You know yourself best. Just trust yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know your process.
Yeah.
I would like to kind of paraphrase one of your Twitter posts because I saw it a few days ago and I was like, that's so true. You as a translator, and, a big misconception is probably like, oh, you're already working in translation, you've done interpretation before, you must know the language really, really well, you're done. But on Twitter, you posted, I'm not done studying. I always have to try to put in some kind of effort to keep my Japanese
Mm-hmm.
going. I really like that Twitter post that you did because it's so true. Learning never ends. You can always learn something
Mm-hmm.
new, especially with languages, because language is always growing. What are some of the things that you do in your, because I mean, you said you passed N2. I don't know if you took N1, but you probably could pass N1 if you wanted to as well. What other kind of methods of studying do you do at this advanced level? Because we've had language episodes on our podcast where we had a teacher come in to explain like beginner level kind of learning. Then we had another guest with immersion level kind of learning for like probably intermediates. And for you, for advanced learners, what advice could you give advanced learners?
I think definitely. So for just for clarification, I have not passed the N1. Um, I think partially because again, dyslexia is just really
Yeah,
annoying, and I can't get through those reading sections fast enough without making mistakes.
I understand completely.
That was me with they have American like standardized tests with the ACT is what they call it. That the one that they focus on in the South is the ACT, and they had reading, and it was always the one that dragged my grade down because I
Same.
just I read slow too, so I can totally relate to being a slow reader. I read for every
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
detail of the sentence, not just quick reading, right? So it would always drag my score down. I'd do really good in other areas, but that reading section
Yep.
was just like all the way down at the bottom. Yes, I
It's
totally get that.
yes, it's
It's a
annoying. It's a
struggle. I
struggle.
don't worry. I understand. I was diagnosed with dyslexia at the second grade level because my parents were really concerned about why I wasn't getting good grades, I guess. So I totally understand that. And actually, manga helped
Mm-hmm,
me
mm-hmm,
a lot with my reading because I wouldn't read regular books. Like, I refused to. It was just so intimidating.
mm-hmm.
I couldn't understand, like, I guess like my eyes would get cross-eyed or something just reading all the
Like
text
you read
on
it,
one
but it won't go in your
page.
head, and you're like, oh god, I gotta
Exactly.
reread that.
So when I got manga, manga it's like panels and it's spaced out,
Mm-hmm.
so it worked perfectly for me. But so I can totally understand why it could be a challenge for you. You have my
So I've had,
sympathy.
thank you. I've Oh no, I've actually lost count. I think I've failed the N1 like 4 or 5 times now. The last time I took it, I failed by 1 point. I was like, no! Oh, it's so close.
But I feel like what Doug said, the JLPT, I feel is kind of like a standardized test. Like, just
Yes.
because you
It really
don't pass
is.
it doesn't mean like your level of Japanese isn't up there.
No, exactly. It isn't reflective of your own skills, but
Definitely not.
I find the JLPT very motivating to make me study.
Yeah.
And I think,
Ah, then there you go.
yeah, so I personally, even though I failed it, I really enjoy taking the exam because I guess I'm a massive masochist.
You just want to get to that reading section, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. But love that reading section. But saying that I'm taking it again this summer. Hopefully it doesn't get cancelled, and hopefully it's safe. Um, but I'm taking it again this summer, and I think at this advanced level, I found, like I said, reading novels, like it was really intimidating at first. And again, when I started, I'd have to look up every word, and it probably took me about 2 months to read one book. But as I've read more and more and more, it's actually increased my reading speed. I think it's definitely helped my JLPT studying. And I think studying on the side as
That's great.
well helps at an advanced level because, like you said, there's a point where you're like, oh, I'm a translator. I don't need to study anymore. I've made it. But you still forget a lot of these advanced vocabulary or kanji maybe you've never studied before. And you're like, I kind of know what that means, but I don't really need to remember it. But I think if you want to improve even further, actually taking the time to study every now and again is a really big help. Once people finish studying or finish passing the N1, they tend to move on to the kanji kente in order to keep studying, keep learning new things. I don't think you need to. I guess it depends on what you prefer, but yeah, mixing studying advanced level Japanese alongside novels is great because all those advanced words and advanced kanji tends to pop up in novels a lot as well. So it's a good way to kind of
Yeah.
expose yourself to the language while also having fun.
One day I'll take the N1. I barely got the
That's awesome.
I barely got the 2. See, I did the old JLPT
Mhm.
when it was only 4 levels, and I got like level 2 by 0.5 points. Like I was like 0.5 away from failing. I
Ooh.
just barely got it because again, the reading section on the Japanese test also sank me, just like the ACT. So I did good in the grammar and the kanji and all that fun stuff, but yeah, reading was just like. But yeah, one day.
One day.
You can't take it locally. You have to like travel to like Houston or Tennessee or
Uh,
somewhere. So it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, for us, you can't take it in Louisiana. Usually
wow.
Yeah.
Louisiana people typically go to either Texas or Nashville,
Yeah.
Tennessee to take it.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you can only do it once a year as well.
Yes,
Can't you?
correct. Yeah, you can only do it during the winter,
Yeah.
December.
No pressure.
Yep, no pressure, not at all. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Before we close off this interview, I kind of wanted to give you the opportunity to pitch any of your social media that you would like people to go check you out on or follow.
Sure. You can find me at Jenn Translations on Twitter, JEN Translations, or jentranslations.com, but there's a hyphen between the J and the N because it's Japanese English Jen. Anyway, bad joke.
No, I like that joke. I always like it.
Or I also have J Talk Online, or on Twitter it's Japan Talk Online for the Japanese learning stuff. And it's where I post a lot of my Japanese novels that I've been reading. And yeah, that's about it. In terms
Yeah,
of social
definitely
media.
go follow her. She posts all the time. Great resource. If you're really into Japanese language, you really need to follow her. She knows what she's doing.
Sure. That's what everyone thinks, at least.
But thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate you sharing your experience in translating. Like I said, when people think of trying to get a job in Japan or regarding Japan, the first thing that you do think of is the language teaching, like teaching English. And it is a good start, but a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people want to kind of expand their profession into something else more than that. So I think this is a good way for people to understand the world of translation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, teaching is definitely a good way. I know so many teachers who are now in game localization, and it's definitely a lot easier in terms of finding work in Japan than my method of just wing it, because there's a high chance I would have never been able to live in Japan.
Yep. So
But
there you go.
I'm glad. I hope people found this useful.
Oh, it was a hell of a journey you talked about. It's great. And shows that you can get there if you put your mind to it,
And luck.
And luck.
Yes.
And luck.
And not
of
LinkedIn.
course.
Yes.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Krewe of Japan podcast. In today's episode, we talked about translation work, especially in the realm of manga translation and localization of video games. We encourage you to learn more about translation by interacting with the online community that our guest Jen was talking about.
Yeah, let us know if you enjoyed our episode. Feel free to give Jen a follow. She mentioned her Twitter accounts on the interview. Give her a follow. Check out her blog. And, let us know what you think if you really enjoyed this episode. And if you would like to hear more about other translators in this industry, we'd love to share some of that content. Or if you have any suggestions, we'd love to share that as well. We're on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is KREWEOFJAPAN Krewe of Japan podcast. And Twitter is just simply Krewe of Japan, KREWEOFJAPAN. While you're there, give us a follow, subscribe, all that fun stuff. We have links in our bios. Check out all of our other guest links that we have listed in our link tree. And enjoy. Give us all the feedback you want. We love to have comments and questions and things that come out. So that's going to be it for today. And until next time, see you then.